The Alaskan wilderness. Vast, unforgiving, and beautiful beyond words. Here, where the snow blankets everything in silence, survival is a constant battle. For Elias Carter, solitude had always been a way of life. A man content with his cabin, his routines, and the quiet company of the towering pines. But one fateful evening, the silence was broken by something unexpected. A scratching at his door, a sound almost swallowed by the howling wind. When he opened it, two figures emerged from the storm, wolves. Not the fierce, untamed predators he had always known, but weary, desperate creatures with hollow eyes. One limped, its leg injured. The other stood protectively, scanning Elias with cautious hope. In that moment, every survival instinct he had ever learned screamed at him to close the door, to stay inside where it was safe. But something in their eyes made him hesitate. Against every rational thought, Elias stepped aside, letting them in. Elias took a step back, his breath curling in the freezing air. The two wolves hesitated, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and cold. A lifetime of instinct told him this was dangerous. Wolves were wild predators, unpredictable and driven by survival. But these wolves were different. They weren't snarling. They weren't attacking. They were pleading. The smaller one, barely able to stand, let out a soft whimper, its injured leg buckling beneath it. The larger one, its sibling or maybe its protector, shifted closer, its piercing amber eyes locked onto Elias's own. It was waiting to see if this human would turn them away or save them. Elias's pulse pounded in his ears. If he let them in, there was no turning back. But if he left them out here, the storm would finish what the wilderness had started. With a steadying breath, he stepped aside. The invitation was unspoken, but understood. Slowly, the larger wolf nudged the smaller one forward, took one shaky step inside, then another until both stood just past the threshold. Snow clung to their fur, melting in small puddles on his wooden floor. The warmth of the cabin seemed to startle them, their bodies stiffening as the sudden shift in temperature hit. Elias shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The wolves stood frozen in place. So did he. What now? Dawn broke with a pale light filtering through the frost-coated windows, but the storm hadn't fully passed. Wind still howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. Inside, a quiet tension remained. The injured wolf slept soundly, its bandaged leg rising and falling with each steady breath. But the larger one had barely rested. It had watched Elias all night. Elias stretched, his muscles aching from sleeping in his chair. His movements stirred the larger wolf, its ears twitching, eyes snapping open in an instant. Still wary, still unsure of him. "I guess we're still on edge, huh?" Elias muttered, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He stood slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, and made his way to the small kitchen area. He hadn't thought about food until now. If he was hungry, the wolves had to be starving. Rummaging through his supplies, he grabbed some dried meat and set a small bowl of water near the fire. The injured wolf lifted its head slightly at the scent, sniffing the air, but the larger one remained stiff, watching his every move. Elias unwrapped a strip of meat and held it out. "Here, you need this more than I do." The injured wolf hesitated before slowly stretching its neck forward, sniffing the offering. Then, with a quick snap, it took the food and chewed weakly. The larger wolf, however, stayed put. He wouldn't accept anything from him. Not yet. Elias sighed and set more food down, stepping away to give them space. It was going to take time. Elias felt a lump in his throat as he watched Mia prepare the sedatives. Every part of him wanted to stop her, to say no, to keep the wolves here where they were safe. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was never meant to be their home. Mia worked quickly, administering a small dose to the injured wolf first. It barely reacted, only blinking sleepily before resting its head back down. The larger wolf, however, wasn't so easily fooled. It stiffened as soon as Mia stepped closer. Its body coiled like a spring. Elias knelt down, voice calm. "It's okay," he murmured. "I won't let anything bad happen to you." The wolf didn't move, but something flickered in its golden eyes. Recognition? Trust? Maybe a little of both. When Mia finally managed to administer the sedative, the wolf's breathing slowed, but it never fully closed its eyes. Even in its drowsy state, it kept its gaze locked on Elias, as if memorizing him, as if saying goodbye. Loading the wolves onto the transport sled felt surreal. The cabin, once filled with their quiet presence, suddenly felt unbearably empty. Elias secured the blankets around them, making sure they were warm, even as his hands trembled. Mia gave him a reassuring look. "You can visit them," she said. "Once they're stable. Once we know they'll be okay." Elias swallowed hard. He nodded, but the words didn't quite reach him, because in his heart, he knew this was the last time he'd see them like this. The engine roared to life, and with one last glance at the only home they had known for days, the wolves were gone, disappearing into the vast, snowy horizon. That night, Elias sat by the fire, staring at the empty space where they had once lain. The cabin had never felt so quiet, so lonely. He reached for his cup of coffee, but his hand froze midair. A single paw print remained near the door. He hadn't noticed it before. Perfect imprint in the wood. A reminder. Elias exhaled shakily and placed an extra blanket near the hearth, just in case. The wilderness had taken many things from Elias over the years, but this time, it had given him something back. A reason to care. Winter turned to spring, and the land began to awaken. The snow thinned, the rivers thawed, and the silence of Elias's world grew heavier. He told himself he was fine, that he didn't need to see them again. But he did. So, when Mia reached out to say the wolves were ready for release, he didn't hesitate. Standing at the edge of a clearing near the research facility, Elias watched as the crate doors opened. The larger wolf stepped out first, glancing around before turning to check on its sibling. The injured wolf, now fully healed, emerged next. Then, something unexpected happened. The larger wolf turned, locking eyes with Elias. A moment passed, and then it stepped forward and nudged his hand. A silent thank you, a final goodbye. As they disappeared into the wild, Elias felt something deep within him settle. He had saved them, but in the end, they had saved him too. The Alaskan wilderness had tested Elias many times before, but never like this. It started as a simple trek, a routine trip to check his traps deeper in the forest. The sky was painted in muted grays, the crisp air carrying the scent of an impending storm. But Elias was no stranger to the unpredictable moods of nature. He had always trusted his instincts. He had always made it home. Until today, a misstep, a patch of hidden ice beneath the fresh snow, and suddenly, the ground vanished beneath him. Elias barely had time to cry out before he was tumbling, his body hitting jagged rocks and ice, his world spinning into a blur of white and pain. When he finally stopped, he found himself at the bottom of a deep ravine, half buried in the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Pain seared through his leg. One look confirmed what he already knew: it was broken. His foot was twisted unnaturally, and every movement sent fresh agony shooting up his spine. He tried to stand but collapsed instantly, his vision swimming. Panic clawed at him. He was miles from his cabin. No one knew where he was, and night was closing in. He shouted, his voice hoarse, barely carrying over the howling wind. But the wilderness swallowed his cries, indifferent and merciless. For the first time in years, Elias felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Fear. As the minutes stretched into hours, the cold seeped into his bones. His fingers were stiff, his breathing shallow. Snow had begun to fall again, light at first, then heavier, as if nature itself was trying to bury him. His eyes fluttered shut. Maybe this was how it ended. Then, a sound, faint at first, distant, but unmistakable. A howl. Elias's breath hitched. His mind played tricks on him, he was sure of it. But then, another howl. Closer, stronger, familiar. His heart pounded as he forced his head up, blinking against the snow. Shadows moved at the edge of the ravine, shapes weaving between the trees. Then, stepping into the pale moonlight, a figure emerged. Amber eyes locked onto his. It was them, the wolves he had saved. But they were not alone. The larger wolf, the one who had once limped through Elias's cabin door, stood at the edge of the ravine, flanked by others. The pack had come. Elias let out a choked breath, half a laugh, half a sob. "You found me," he whispered. The larger wolf let out a sharp bark, stepping forward, its body tense, its gaze scanning the terrain. Then, as if giving silent orders, the pack moved. 2 wolves descended carefully into the ravine, their paws finding footholds where Elias could not. They reached him, sniffing at his wounds, their warm breath fanning against his frozen skin. The larger wolf followed, moving with a purpose Elias barely understood until he felt the pressure. It was nudging him, trying to lift him. Understanding struck him like lightning. They weren't just here to mourn him. They were here to save him. Summoning what little strength he had left, Elias grasped onto the thick fur of the larger wolf. The animal didn't flinch. It held firm, bracing as Elias pulled himself forward, pain screaming through his body. The other wolves pressed against his sides, stabilizing him as he struggled up the slope, each step a battle between survival and surrender. But he wasn't fighting alone. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the pack guided him up, their bodies shielding him from the relentless wind. When he slipped, they caught him. When he faltered, they pressed forward. Until finally, they reached the top. Elias collapsed onto the snow, his breath ragged, his body trembling from exhaustion. He barely registered the way the larger wolf curled around him, shielding him from the cold, the others forming a protective circle around them. His eyes drifted shut, but this time he wasn't afraid. When he woke, dawn had broken. The storm had passed, and in its place was a golden sky, stretching endlessly over the frozen horizon. The wolves were still there. The larger one sat beside him, watching, waiting. Elias moved his fingers, testing his limbs, wincing as pain flared through his leg. He was alive. He had made it. Because of them. With a slow, shaky breath, Elias reached out. The wolf didn't pull away. It leaned in, pressing its forehead against his. A silent promise. A bond unbroken. Elias let out a hoarse chuckle. "Guess I owe you one." The wolf let out a soft chuff, nudging him one last time before turning, leading its pack back into the wild. But as Elias watched them disappear into the trees, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be alone again. Not really, because out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, his family was watching, waiting, and if he ever needed them again, they would come.